because kids are going to learn 100 times more from what they see you do than what you tell them to do. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind that you can tell them to regulate their emotions all day long, but if every time something bad happens, you fly off the handle and start screaming, that's what they're learning, right?
Welcome to the Dad Central Show, hosted by Ed Gough Jr. and Drew Soleyn. We know dads want to see their kids succeed, but they don't always know how to get there. This show gives dads the tools they need to raise confident and successful kids.
What is up, everybody? It is Ed Gough Jr. of the Dad Central Show and Dad Central. And I am so happy. I haven't heard from this guy in a while. So he's here. Have no fear. Drew is here. What's going on?
Well, thanks, Ed. Yeah, Drew Soleyn from the Dad Central Show. What's going on is I've been meeting with a lot of dads lately and having some phenomenal conversations because the program, Developing the Father Within You, is launching, and we're going to be starting towards the end of March, beginning of April. And so I'm doing these application calls for dads who want to be part of this program and hearing their stories, hearing their passion. And I love just hearing how eager and excited they are for growing themselves as fathers and as leaders. And that's the core of the program. And so, I mean, it takes energy to have these conversations, but I honestly receive so much energy back just connecting with other dads and hearing their just their stories and their energy. So anyway, so what's going on is I'm excited about this. I'm excited about the connections. I'm excited about the program, and I'm excited about what we're going to be doing through the next few months together.
All right.
What's going on with you?
Well, let's not make it less 2 months. Let's make it for a long journey.
Yeah. Well, the program's 10 weeks. It's about a 3-month commitment.
Well, you know what?
We support them for the rest. But anyways,
there you go. There you go. Before we go any further, the Dad Central Show is sponsored by Dove Plus Care. Dove Plus Care believes that care is the best of a man because when men care for themselves and others, there's a positive impact. Always thank you, DM Plus C, for that support. Drew, you're going to say something. I'll say what's going on with me. A lot of times I'm gradually going tornado, but I do give myself grace. And we were on a call with some fathers recently. I don't know if there's so much going on, but I'm getting a number of inquiries from mothers about dads need help. Our dads need help. Our dad needs help. Our dads need help. Last week, I was on a call, 2 calls within 10 hours with 2 ladies who don't know each other, who are both saying the same thing, says, what can you do to help? And I said, so I'm in a little bit of a reflection time on what's the next best thing that I can do to help fathers and families.
What's your answer?
I'm still reflecting on it. Still reflecting on it, but there is some clarity coming, and I know one area that will help dads and their families and Dad Central, so I've got to put some time and make some time to make that happen. Won't tell you yet.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to hearing.
Well, good. Well, you'll benefit too. You're going to be the first person that benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I was going to say is the cool part about the Developing the Father With You. I'm speaking with people all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from Vancouver to throughout Canada. I had a conversation with somebody in Zimbabwe today. Spoke with somebody in Latvia. I mean, that's been the coolest part.
Well, thank you for getting global, my man. I'm going to pull you out of your little place there in the city you live in. I'm not going to give it the city you live in, but actually, and I mirror that. I've had a conversation with someone who's on this show who believe he lives in South Korea, and that reminds me. And there's a conversation from Czechoslovakia from a lady that runs a group who I don't know how they found me, but they want to have a conversation. So it's a global initiative. Yes, we're based here in Canada, where, believe it or not, when recording this today, yes, it's still winter, but it's like 50 degrees outside. So a lot of my American compadres are saying, what's going on with your country? I said, shush.
Okay, well, we're speaking of weather. We're actually hosting a new friend, as you like to say today.
Yep.
We're going to be talking with Dr. Scott Grant. He is the creator and host of the Docs to Dads podcast. He is actually a practicing pediatrician in Phoenix, Arizona. They just actually relocated from Detroit, Michigan
Wow.
to Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a little bit jealous of the sun and warmth that they're getting. So, Dr. Grant, welcome to the show. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you very much. Very excited to be here.
Awesome.
Ah.
Well, Dr. Grant, we typically like to start the show getting a little bit more of the backstory. So why don't you get us caught up? Tell us a little bit more about Dr. Grant and before you became Dr. Grant.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in Southwest Oklahoma and then moved pretty quickly down into Texas, grew up in a suburb of Dallas, where my parents bought the house that they still live in 3 days before my first birthday. So my dad, actually, both my parents, their dads were in the military, both my grandfathers. So they moved around all over the place. And so one of my dad's big things was my kids are not going to move around. Like once we start them in a school, they're going to complete school. They're going to keep their friends. They're not going to have to like remake new friends every 18 months the way that I did. And so he kept that promise to my mom and to us as kids, me and my brother. And so we stayed there. And so I was in Dallas for basically all of my childhood, and then went to undergrad college there also in the Dallas area, just north of Dallas. Did medical school on the border in El Paso, Texas, which is a beautiful, wonderful little town. And so as I moved out west further and further, I sort of got the Southwest bug and sort of fell in love with the Southwest vibe, and so moved out a little further to Phoenix here for my residency. And so for folks who don't know a little bit about medical training and the way that works here in the United States and in a variety of other places, is you go to medical school first to become sort of an unspecialized physician. You sort of learn a little bit about everything that you might need to know, whether you want to be a surgeon or an eye specialist or a pediatrician or a psychiatrist or whatever specialty you might want to go into. And then after you graduate from medical school, you go through a match process that matches you to a residency, which is where you become a specialist in whatever it is that you want to do. Shout out to the current fourth year medical students. Match day is coming up soon. So I know there's a lot of stress and angst. So if there's anybody out there in that situation, we're all pulling for you. And so that's what brought me originally out here to Phoenix, where I did my residency out here at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Was a chief resident out here, and then relocated to Michigan, as you mentioned, for my wife to do her training. She's also a physician. And we had our 3 kids there who are now 5.5, 3.5, and 17 months. And then decided after some heavy soul searching that we wanted to come back to the sunshine, and found our way back here to Phoenix. And that's kind of the short version of the story.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm always curious, when you started talking about your dad's promise, and then his both grandfathers were in the military. I just thought of that influence of the military moving around and how powerful that experience obviously was for your dad, because he wanted to quickly change that. Maybe like, what was the influence? Did that have any influence on you growing up at all? And
I don't think I knew any other way, but I know that I was grateful to, like, looking back, I can see how useful it was in terms of like staying with my same group of friends and being able to stay. I was really involved in band and sort of made the all-state band as a senior in high school and all these kinds of things. And so having consistent coaching and teaching and those kinds of things in some of those ways, I'm sure was really helpful as it pertains to that. And I think it also kind of helped us develop a sense of community around our family. And I'll say that, when we were thinking about moving our family here across country, none of my kids are in school quite yet. And it was one of the sort of influencing factors for us to say, like, if we don't move now, we're sort of at this inflection point where our oldest is going to be starting kindergarten soon. And so if we don't move now, it's just going to get harder and harder as our kids start school and develop some of those friendships and those kinds of things. And so it was an influence in that way. I don't know, maybe it's also been an influence. Some of this is just medical training and you don't really have a choice. And so you end up moving around quite a lot based on like, where can you get into medical school and where do you match for residency and all of these kinds of things. But it's a little bit interesting that after, 18 years of living in the exact same place and not moving at all, now sort of I've moved around to all these different places and sort of seen different parts of the world. And I do have a little bit of a travel bug. I like to travel around to different places and see different things. And so there's probably a little bit of both there in terms of the way that I think about raising my kids as a father, but also in terms of like this like travel bug and wanting to see the world, because we didn't really do a lot of that when I was a kid.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Ed?
I don't know if I should ask this now, but I will ask it now.
Sure.
When I listen to you share with our family, one of the words that hits my mind is transition. You've had to do a lot of transitioning professionally, but how does the word transition impact you as a father?
Oh, that's good. I think especially sort of this has been the first like really big transition. The home that we lived in Michigan was sort of the home that we brought all three of our kids home to. And so that house sort of has a special place in our mind. And so you can imagine sort of as just one person moving around. And then even sort of once I was engaged to my now wife, and after we got married, we had some moves around. She sort of lived in even more different places than I have kind of along our journey. We were long distance for 3 years trying to kind of make things work, including the first 9 months of our marriage and all kinds of, pieces to that. And certainly there's a lot of transitioning and a lot of extra work that you have to put into making those relationships work in that context. But it's something that we put a lot of thought into in terms of how do we help make sure that our kids transition as smoothly as possible to a very different place and a different climate and a different environment and a different school and all of these different things. And so that's something that we put a lot of thought into. I think just like with a lot of things if you're helping kids through these difficult transitions, we did a lot of planning, talking through like, how do we want to do this? And then you do a lot of storytelling of like, this is what's going to happen. And we sort of would show the kids pictures of the house that we're moving to, the house we live in now. We would show kids pictures of the neighborhood and the school they were going to go to and those kinds of things, so that when they saw them for the first time in real life, they had some reference point to refer back to from that. And then what's the storytelling that we do about the life that we're leaving behind, right? We have several really dear friends, who have kids that are the same age as our kids, that were sort of their best friends, that we had to make the very difficult decision to step away from. And so how do we tell the story of that? Like, we're going to be able to come back and visit those folks. We're going to be able to see them and talk to them. And they're still really special to us. And sort of how do we have those conversations as well? And then you sort of do it and you kind of deal with it in real time. My middle child, my daughter, has probably had, I would say, the has talked the most about our home in Michigan as we've made this transition. And so just knowing between my wife and I that we need to spend a little more time sitting with her and talking through like, yeah, we miss the Michigan house too. What are the things you loved about the Michigan house? How can we kind of recreate that or create, really implant those as like positive memories that she has that we can always go back to or that we can try to revisit sometime as well. And I think those are the kinds of things that you think about as you sort of help your kids through these transitions.
I know that I'll bring it back to Drew in just a second, but I really like the way you use the word storytelling in a different aspect, because most of the time, dads, parents, it's storytelling, telling a bedtime story.
Mm.
But you have incorporated storytelling in your everyday life as a father, not just the going to bed at night. I really want to bless you. And I think that's a really key point that I hope everyone that's listening or watching this picks up on. So Drew, back to you.
Thanks, Ed. I think that's a great point as well. And that's something that I picked up is, you were, as you were sharing the story about transition, you were also teaching some, I think, really important lessons and principles of how to support, how to engage in this fatherhood role in difficult times or in times when maybe there isn't a clear roadmap. And one of the things I'm curious about, or that came to me as you were sharing and Ed was talking, is many times as dads, I've seen this, maybe even I've done it sometimes, we see our children having a hard time with something that's going on. And it's actually hard for us because we don't want our kids to go through hard times. And we haven't talked about this yet, but obviously, your training and being a pediatrician, you're a specialist in understanding children and children's medicine, as well as probably the parenting aspect of that. So I don't want to digress, but the main point is, how did you manage yourself and whatever was coming up for you in that process of supporting your kids with this big transition?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's such a great point, because so much of the way that we interact with our kids starts with like, where are we at personally? And so I'm going through things too, as I'm transitioning from my life in Michigan to my life in Phoenix, sort of independently of my family in some way, right? Like, I'm starting a new job, I'm trying to make new friends. I left my dear friends behind in Michigan as well, and so I have thoughts about that. I'm trying really hard to kind of maintain some connection to those folks as well, and so I'm struggling with some of those things as well. And then when my daughter speaks up about like some of the things that she's missing about being in Michigan, it's really easy to feel that way, because in this situation especially, I think dads go through similar things all the time. Not only do I not want to see my daughter struggle, but like in a real way, like, this is my fault that she's going through this struggle. Like, I'm the one who decided, my wife and I as a team, like, we decided that we were making this big move, and if we hadn't done that, then she wouldn't be in the situation at all, right? And so there's an extra layer of guilt that can kind of come with that. But keeping in mind a couple of, I think, really important points are, one is that we discerned this decision for a long time, right? And like, we decided that we thought this was in the best interest of our family, and so trusting in that process that we went through, and that the relationship that I have with my wife to make these kinds of decisions was the first thing. The second is, one of the things I say all the time in clinic, a couple of like buzzwords I'm going to throw out soon, but one of the things is, get curious, not furious, is one of my favorite things. Like, when kids are acting out, when they're struggling, when they're having a hard time, you just remember, like, get curious, not furious. Like, it's so easy sometimes as a dad to like, we got to get moving, we got to get you to school, like whatever, these meltdowns always happen at the most inopportune times. And so what are the things that I can do? I can like lose my cool and yell, and where does that get us? It just doesn't really move us along very much. And that doesn't mean I don't do that sometimes. I'm definitely guilty of that myself. But when I can remember to try to like look past whatever the meltdown is and get to sort of what's happening, what brought this on, and remember my other favorite catchphrase in this situation, which is, kids do well when they can. Like, she's not melting down just to annoy me. She's not melting down because she thinks this is a good time for that. Like, she's melting down because something is happening, right? And my boys do this just as often. It's certainly not unique to her. But like, when these meltdowns are happening, they're not trying to annoy me. They're in their emotions, and we need to do something about that. And so, how can we move forward with that, is really important. But I have to maintain my own emotional regulation and sort of keep my head in those moments, which sometimes is easy and sometimes it's not. But when I can do that, that's definitely when we have the best outcomes, because I can keep my cool and I can dive into what's really going on here, and then try to find a path forward, rather than just like brute force, like, go get in the car, right? Like, we've all been there.
Yeah, absolutely. Ed, over to you, and then I got a couple things after for sure.
Yeah. I think of you sometimes walking a tightrope, because what you do professionally and what you do as a dad.
Mhm.
How do you navigate it? And you're not perfect. Let's just realize the doc ain't perfect. None of us are.
None
But
of us are.
yeah, how challenging at times can you be navigating with your career in the medical field, pediatrician, and being a wonderful dad, father, husband?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that come to mind in that context. One is just sort of, it's good that I have the book knowledge to like know like what are the kinds of strategies that we can use, and that's part of the kinds of stuff that I try to share in the podcast and certainly in my clinical work. But again, that doesn't mean that I'm always great at remembering it in the moment, because our kids have a way of pushing our unique buttons. Usually, they're like our bad habits reflected back to us. I have found that those are usually the most sort of annoying things. And then that brings on a whole other layer of emotion of like, it's my fault that you have this terrible trait. And you can really spiral in that way too. But you do kind of walk that tightrope of sort of trying to do your best every day and showing up every day and being present and having those conversations. And I think the big thing that there's starting to be a larger conversation about now that I'm happy to contribute to, and I think is really important, is this idea of repair. Like, kids don't grow into like good, healthy, functioning adults because they have good, perfect parents who never screwed up and never yelled at them and never lost their cool, right? The whole idea of relationship, any meaningful relationship that you have, whether it's with your friend, whether it's with your wife, it's with your kids, is going to have these moments of rupture, of break. And the magic of those relationships comes in the repair, right? And so being able to go back and say, like, dude, I'm really sorry I lost my cool earlier. That wasn't, I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I should have done a better job of controlling my emotions. And this is another place where you do the storytelling, right? Everything that we do as parents in some ways is like telling our story, right? And so it's not only like, I'm sorry because I raised my voice and you got upset, right? And I don't like that I made you feel that way. And that's certainly true. But the other thing is that this is a teaching moment of like, when I got upset, my feelings got too big for me, or whatever the language is that you like to use. That's the language that we use sometimes in our house. And then what should I have done differently? And I should have taken a couple of deep breaths before we started having that conversation, right? So we do the one that I use is called flower and candle. So we smell the flower and blow out the candle, and that's kind of the way that I think about sort of teaching kids to deep breathe. And so when my son is getting kind of activated a little bit, I'll just say like flower and candle, buddy, and he knows what that means, and he'll like take some deep breaths, and we kind of go from there. And so those are the kinds of things that you can do as storytelling. So you're repairing the relationship, right? You're saying, I'm sorry I lost my cool, I shouldn't have raised my voice. But you're also then saying, this is what I should have done instead. So that if your child, when they're in that situation, right? Not if, when your child is in that same situation and they're activated and their emotions are getting a little bit too big, they might remember eventually what you told them that you should do in that situation, right? And so that's kind of where you lean into that repair.
That's good. That's really good. Drew, you want to go on? I can mention one more thing, but I know you have some things you want to mention, so go for it.
Go for it, Ed.
Yeah, I like that repair. I was just putting in my digital notes here, like the 3 R's: repair, restore, recovery.
I love that.
That's really good. And I love your thought process, your mindset about repairing. The repair is so important, and being honest and open with your kids, saying, hey, I messed up. Getting down to that level. And just, I think that's so, so important. You have a unique lens on fatherhood. You are one, and you see many of them. What sort of lens are you getting on fatherhood as we're here in 2024?
Yeah, great question. I love it when I get to see dads in clinic. It's not that common, unfortunately. Like, I wish I got to talk to more dads, and that's another reason why I started the podcast, to just like start to have some of those conversations outside as well. I've certainly heard a lot of stories from dads, and I'm sure you've heard similar stories of dads sort of not always being the most welcome in the healthcare setting. So that's another conversation I try to have with my colleagues on the other side, is to say, like, when you have a dad in your clinic, like, that's great. That's an opportunity to have those conversations and pour into that dad and help train them. And I think more and more, our generation of dads is really interested in being engaged and involved in what's happening in their homes and with caring for their children and helping to raise their children. And especially, in 2024, I mentioned my wife is also a physician. A lot of us have spouses that are working and have careers as well. And so if we want to live in a world, which I do, where we're supporting those endeavors, and I want my wife, she's an amazing surgeon, and I want her to be as amazing as she can be. Part of that, by necessity, means that I'm helping out at home as much as I can. I'm doing my part of the home, domestic life that we're building here, right? It's a thing that we're doing together, my wife and I. And so I think the challenge comes with a lot of dads that while my female friends in high school were babysitting and learning how to care for kids of various ages, I was cleaning a movie theater, right? That was my first job, was working at a movie theater. And so I talked to so many dads who the first baby that they hold is their own baby. And they're like, here, this is a tiny human that you're now responsible for. And dads are like, I have no idea what to do. I've never held a baby. I don't know how to like hold them safely. I don't know how to cuddle them. I don't know how to change a diaper. I've never done that before. Like, there's so many things. Like, what do I feed this kid? Like, when do we start solid foods? Like, there's so many questions that folks have that you just don't know the answer to because you've never had an opportunity to learn those things. And so I think that's a place that I try to speak into in the podcast, is to say, like, there's all these skills that dads need to be the active, engaged dad that they want to be, right? We're not trying to push. I mean, I am trying to encourage dads to be as more engaged even than they are, but there's so many dads out there that want to be engaged. They want to be actively involved in what's happening in their home. They want to be actively involved in their kids' lives, and they don't always have the skills. And so they're kind of making it up as they go, or they're trying to learn from their wife, like, what do I do with this? All these kinds of things. And so that's another place that I'm trying to speak into for dads to, like, help them have the skills and have the knowledge that they need to be successful and effective in that context.
Well, I just want to correct. You are doing it. You're not trying to. You are doing it. Just want to correct that. Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
Drew.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Thank you, Dr. Grant. I'd like to maybe take a step back. I've loved this conversation. I love the content you're sharing. I think it's so relevant, but I think we're also making an assumption that everyone's listening has the same understanding of how important dads are to the development of their children. And of course, Dad Central was founded on that research. It's a big part of why we do what we do. But maybe if you could, let's level set this, like the importance of a father in contributing to child's healthy development, and why what you're talking about in terms of they want to be involved, which is fantastic, but then the skills gap that exists that may prevent some of these amazing things that when a dad is involved can happen. So can you talk about the importance of dads when it comes to like child development?
Yes, and I can't rattle most of these statistics off the top of my head, but I know that at basically every stage of life, having an active, engaged dad in a child's life is good for everyone involved, right? So having an active, engaged dad starting from the moment of infancy leads to decreased bad health outcomes, not just for baby, but also for mom, like decreased risks of things like postpartum depression and anxiety for mom, increased healing time, like improved healing time, those kinds of things for mom to be able to bounce back after especially difficult deliveries. That sense of community that you start to build with your family from those very early days is very important. That sense of bonding, and then as kids grow, they tend to, play a lot more with dads. There's some interesting research that's coming out about sort of the way that kids play with mom or prefer to play with mom versus the way kids prefer to play with dads, and they want to do that sort of more rough and tumble play with dads, and that helps build that bonding really well as well. And then as kids get older, you talk about decreased risks of things like recreational drug use and teen pregnancy and high risk sexual behavior and all these other kinds of things, in addition to positive outcomes like academic achievements and high school graduation rates, and all these kinds of things go up dramatically when there's an active, engaged dad in the home. So here in the United States, this sounds like what you do where you are in the United States. There's another great organization called the National Fatherhood Institute, fatherhood.org. Chris Brown runs that thing. I've had him as a guest on my podcast. He's an excellent guy. I just collaborated with them on a project to kind of update some of their developmental milestones and sort of what are the things that dads can do to try to help their kids meet their developmental milestones in the back of all of their content. And they just have pages and pages of all of this research around how being an active, engaged dad is good for you as the father. It's good for your kids. It's good for mom. Whether you're in a relationship with mom or not, but especially if you are. And there's a lot of really great data about how important it is for dads to be involved.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I wanted to have that from you,
Great.
just because of your position and credibility. But now, so I just wanted to have that piece, but let's maybe come back to then this idea of you shared a great example of helping your children with this transition, and you were essentially helping them with learning some skills themselves, and as well as modeling them. But can we talk about the process of then supporting our kids to develop this whole emotional regulation piece? Because we talked about ourselves going through transitions, the difficulties we have, but let's talk about, because we are so important and we contribute so significantly to the family, how do we help then our children in this process, or how do we contribute to that process of teaching our children about managing themselves?
Great. I think that first and foremost, it is the case that you have to develop these skills yourself because kids are going to learn 100 times more from what they see you do than what you tell them to do. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind that you can tell them to regulate their emotions all day long. But if every time something bad happens, you fly off the handle and start screaming, that's what they're learning, right? Like if every time something bad happens, your response is with some type of physical or verbal aggression towards whoever it is that you perceive has wronged you, that's what they're going to learn. So it is important for us to start with like, well, how am I doing personally with my emotional regulation? How am I doing with like finding myself in those moments and being able to take that pause so I can respond instead of react to whatever might have happened. And there's more R words for you there, Ed. Um, so that I can respond to what happened versus reacting to it. And that can help me sort of keep my emotional regulation in place, right? And then that's when we start to teach our kids these skills. And so there's sort of a timeline that you work through, just like with any other developmental milestone, right? Like when you want your kids to learn how to walk, first they watch you walk and you kind of walk them through, they see you walking, and then eventually you sort of pull them up by their little hands and put their feet on the floor and you kind of bounce them along. They're not doing anything. You're kind of doing most of the work, but you're kind of showing like, look, here we are, we're on our feet, we're bouncing along. Then they start to, while you're holding their hands, start to take steps independently, right? And then eventually they can walk on their own. And you kind of have to go through that same process with basically anything that you're going to teach your kids how to do, right? And so there's a process to it developmentally. And so developmentally for emotional regulations, the first thing is you can't manage an emotion if you don't know what it is. So learning early on, like just to name emotions, like starting with the basic one. So we started from an early age. Actually, this is my wife's genius move, but starting sort of as we're doing bedtime, one of our sort of go-to bedtime games is happy, sad, angry. Like what's something that made you sad today? What's something that made you angry today? What's something that made you happy today? We try to do them in that order. So we finish with the happy, but just sort of talking about sort of what does it mean to be sad? What does it mean to be angry? What does it mean to be happy? And then from then you can kind of expand it to include some other things, because then they'll say something that made them angry, and then you can say like, oh, did that make you angry or did that make you frustrated, right? And then you kind of have this conversation about like what's the difference between being angry and being frustrated, right? Because they're kind of related and they can kind of look the same, but like what's the difference, right? And so you can have those kinds of conversations as well so that they can name the emotion that they're feeling when they're frustrated, or when they're having a big feeling of some kind. And then you can go into sort of like what are the tactics that we can use to try to get our bodies back under control, whether that's deep breathing. There's lots of different ways to do that. There's the like classic Sesame Street Elmo belly breathing video that everyone loves. That's a great one. I talked about flower and candle already. There's a lot of different ways to sort of teach kids how to do that. There's also other ways, you want to tense some muscles and relax some muscles intentionally to try to like release some of that tension that you're having. So, squeeze your fists and then let them go and feel that relaxing happen and then do it again, right? And do that a few times. There are a lot of tactics that you can teach that might work for you or might work for your kids. And so those are just a couple of examples, and you can sort of find a lot more of them there to kind of help them like manage when those feelings are getting big. And then the last thing is to be able to then talk about those emotions. So like, I'm having a big feeling. This is what it is. I'm trying to get it under control. And this is how I think we should move forward in terms of controlling helping me manage this emotion, right? Is there something outside of me that I need help with from my parents to help navigate this? Or is this just something that I'm frustrated about that I need to kind of move on to a different toy, or I need some intervention to help, have my friends share the toy with me or something like that, depending on what the situation is. But you have to kind of walk them through these steps, step by step. So you have to name the emotion, you have to be able to manage the emotion, and then you have to be able to talk about the emotion. I think that's kind of a general way to think about like, how do I teach these kinds of skills to my kids?
Okay, that's great. Are you a dad who feels like you're juggling a million things at once? Balancing work, family, and personal goals can be overwhelming. But what if there was a solution? That's why we created our new fatherhood community called Dad Mentor. For over 20 years, Dad Central has built practical tools to help dads. We understand the challenges you face and provide the support you need to thrive. The biggest complaint we hear from dads is there's no dedicated support for their specific needs, but not anymore. Our new community, called Dad Mentor, is here to transform your fatherhood experience. Imagine feeling in control, staying calm and patient when your children misbehave. Picture yourself connected to your children, guiding them with confidence and watching them succeed. When you join Dad Mentor, you'll have access to a community of like-minded dads committed to their dad journey, just like you. You'll also get the Dad's Roadmap. This is a step-by-step plan to help you go from unsure to unstoppable as a dad. Monthly masterclasses and Q&A sessions. You'll get answers and know exactly what to do straight from experts. Monthly group meetups that connect dads over common topics. A dad's resource library. Curated webinars, podcasts, or guides built by Dad Central to help you grow as a parent. And finally, you'll also get exclusive members-only offers and events. Now, many dads do try to do this fatherhood thing alone, only to find themselves trapped in frustration and strained relationships. Then they may turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms like drugs, alcohol, or other distractions, leaving their family and their own well-being at risk. We don't want you to reach that point of regret. Take steps to invest in you and your family today. Join Dad Mentor and go from stressed, tired, and overwhelmed to confident, calm, and connected. Join us today by going to dadcentral.ca/dads. What I was thinking about now is developmentally, are there ages and stages that are much more challenging for children around, becoming more aware of emotions or having big emotions, that when dads are like, oh, okay, I can expect this at this particular age and stage, then they're not like pulling their hair, like, what's going on here? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first big one I would say happens about where my youngest is right now, when they're sort of first learning to talk and they want to like express their needs and tell you what they need, but they can't. And so the only way that they sometimes have to like express those frustrations is just to like melt down. And so like working with them through sort of as a child who can't use their words quite yet to express like what they're feeling or what their needs are, or those kinds of things, working through that with them as you go is sort of the first big one. I would say there's usually another one somewhere. I feel like 2 gets a bad rap generally. Maybe that's an unpopular opinion. Like 2 is fine for me and my kids. It's like when they get into that 3, when they start to develop that sense of independence and they want to do things for themselves, but they're not quite ready to do most of those things yet, and they still need a little bit of help. They don't want the help. That's another place where some of that frustration can really bubble up and cause some problems. That's also usually the time where a lot of families are starting to put kids into like preschool programs and those kinds of things. So the social requirements on them start to jump up a little bit, kind of right there, or maybe for some kids it's later as kids get into kindergarten and those kinds of things. But like as those social pressures start to creep up a little bit, where they have to share a little bit more because there's more kids in the room and those kinds of things, that's another place where kids can get a little bit overwhelmed in terms of managing those emotions. And then I think certainly as you get into like the preteen and adolescent years, certainly all the hormone changes are going to increase some emotional dysregulation as well. That's also the point where they start to shift their focus away from like the family as sort of the identifying unit that they identify with, and more towards like their friend group. And so the social identity that they develop in that context becomes much more important to them. And so they're much more reactive to what they perceive as changes in that social hierarchy, or the way that their friends are talking about them, or those kinds of things. And that's another place where emotional dysregulation can come into play and can lead to some of those, not great choices that teenagers sometimes make.
Okay. So 1.5-ish,
Yeah.
3,
Yeah.
and like the preteen and teen.
Yeah. That
age.
11, 12 transitional time into puberty is tough too.
Yeah. I've got a 13-year-old and I got twin 11-year-olds. So those 11-year-olds, I'm seeing in a 13-year-old. And then we got Eliana's 10 months old. And then so Jordan is 8. He's in between. He's like the sweet spot. He's like sweet, beautiful, kind, respect. Anyway, sorry. It's not about me.
Those kids, they have their own different set of challenges, but usually the emotional stuff is easy. They're working on trying to like figure out their identity and other kinds of social groups, but they're not as influenced by their friends at school as they are when they're a little bit older. So
Yeah.
enjoy these days while he still cares what you think.
Yeah, well, dads, I wanted that for dads just to be aware, right? I mean, the more that you are aware that there's going to be more challenges at a particular age and stage, the
Mhm.
more that I think you can begin the right mindset to respond versus react.
Right.
So that's why I just wanted to get some of that information out there. I think it's really valuable. At least it was helpful for me as I learned them as my children went through the different stages. Ed, sorry, I've been monopolizing. Over to you.
No, it's okay. I know as we're starting to wind down the conversation, I'd just like to know if you could provide some suggested tips. You've talked about emotional, relative, but some general communication for dads when it comes to communicating with their kids. If you can share some tips, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think again, this is a thing that I struggle with a little bit as well. You have to kind of know your own personality, right? Like I am somebody who thinks out loud and sometimes just expect that my kids are listening to what I'm saying at every moment and responding to what I say, and they're not. And that's pretty common. So one thing I've learned, especially with my oldest, is that I really need to make sure that I have his attention before I expect him to act on anything that I say, right? So if he's like off playing in the corner and I say something like, okay, guys, we are going to get our shoes on and we're going to get out the door, like he's not doing anything. He has no knowledge that what I just said relates to him in any way. There are so many other people in the house, and he is in his own little world over there. And so what I really need to do is try to make sure that I have his attention first. So I'll call him by name or I'll walk over to him and try to make sure that I have his attention. Ideally, he's like looking at me in the eyes and I'll say, this is what I need you to do. Let's get moving. And then that goes 100 times better than just screaming 6 or 8 or 12 times, right? Because then you get to like the sixth time and you're like, I've said this 100 times. How come nobody's listening, right? And we've all been there. But the more you can sort of make sure that whatever child you're trying to talk to most directly, you have their attention. And sometimes that means I have to give the instruction 3 separate times in 3 different ways to my 3 different kids, right? And so just being aware of that is important as well. The other thing is to remember that kids have their processing time is slower than an adult's, right? So if you say, "Hey, don't do that," and they do it the one more time that they were already kind of halfway, like, my we're in the sports phase now, so my son always, my oldest always has a ball in his hand. He's throwing it at a wall. He's doing something, and it drives me crazy sometimes. And so I'll just be like, "Hey, don't do that," right? As he's like right here, like that ball's going to go. There's just nothing to do about it. You can't get mad about that. So do your best with that. Like give them that 30 seconds before you say it again, because sometimes you'll just say like, hey, go upstairs and get your PJs so that we can get ready for bed. And he'll like keep doing his thing. And then if you just give him a second, it just takes a little while for him to like process that and realize, oh, I need to stop what I'm doing right now and go and do that. And so you can't expect immediate reaction the same way that you would with like if I'm having a conversation with my wife of like, hey, can you throw me my keys or whatever, like she can do that quickly, right? Because she has a prefrontal cortex that's fully developed and can help me with those kinds of things, right? Your children are not going to be there. Even your older kids, it's going to take a little bit of time for them to sort of process the information and then make a decision about how they're planning to move forward with whatever your request was. And so I think the more you can be clear about what you're requesting, give them that moment to sort of process what you're asking them to do and move forward. That's going to help you be a lot more successful and hopefully raise your voice a lot less.
Great stuff. And I think we should also practice that as adults too.
Sure.
Because adults process things at different times and sometimes they can be diverted with the attention span. So the great
and
stuff.
Nobody likes being screamed at, right?
No.
Like nobody wants to be yelled at. So, and that's true for your kids too. So if they can avoid getting yelled at, they're going to do that. Again, they do well when they can, but they have a smaller toolbox to work with than you do in terms of navigating through all of these things. So they don't want to get yelled at. So don't, try not to yell at them.
I have to jump in here because I know we're winding up, but Scott, if you want to, I want you to just maybe go a little bit deeper on that point about kids hold on to emotions.
Yeah.
It doesn't just stay right there. So I had a situation a number of years ago, won't get deep, where a father was yelling at his 3-year-old. Yeah. Yeah. And I said to him after, I said, do you realize that your son may be holding on to that for a long time?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and this is something that you sort of learn about in theory, but until, my oldest is a pretty high feeling kid, and so I learned pretty quickly that when I would say stuff to him, even if I wasn't yelling, if I said something that was like in a fairly stern tone or maybe wasn't as nice as I wish it was when it came out of my mouth, like he remembers it and he remembers the exact words that I use. And so it'll be something where we'll have a challenge in the morning, and that night when I'm putting him to bed, he'll be just like in tears, like, "I'm sorry, dad, blah blah," and he'll just basically repeat back whatever I said to him. And I'm like, "Man, you've been holding on to this all day." And so I think it's good for us to remember in our own emotional regulation to take that moment so that we can respond in the way that we want to, right? And this is not to say, that you can't you can discipline your kids and treat them with respect. And I believe that, and I'll go to my grave to believing that, right? So you can raise good kids who are respectful and who have good self discipline, and be respectful to them. And in fact, I think that's the best way to accomplish that goal. But they are going to carry those things along with them, and that's going to be um, it could be a while. But it also gets back to that point of repair, right? So if you're somebody who was raised in a house as a dad when you were a kid where yelling was the primary mode of communication, you may not know, like, what should I do instead? That's the only thing I've ever seen work, and it worked for me. And so, quote unquote. And so, like, that's the only way I know how to do things. And so a lot of times with parents more broadly, like, you can't just tell them not to do something. You have to tell them what to do instead. Like, what are the skills that we can develop to try to do a little bit better? And that's where the emotional regulation, taking that moment, respond, don't react, try to communicate calmly and directly about kind of what the issue is and how you want to move forward, and try to avoid the screaming and those kinds of things, because they will carry that with them. But it also gets back to the repair, right? Like, if you're somebody who was raised in a house with a lot of screaming, and so now your house has become a house with a lot of screaming, like, that's okay. You probably haven't permanently damaged your child at this point, but there is some work that needs to be done to repair that relationship, because if everything that goes wrong leads to screaming, yelling, fighting, spanking, whatever version of that, whatever that looks like in your house, like, you should probably stop doing that. And hopefully we've shared some tips today to help you not do any of those things again, or at least much less frequently. And then there's a repair process that has to take place. And again, that can be an educational process for both you and your kids, right? To say, it's not that they shouldn't have been in trouble. It's not that what they were doing was okay, right? What they were doing might have still been a problem. They might have still needed some kind of intervention, but we need to address that problem differently in the future. And this is how we're going to do that.
Thanks a lot for that, Drew.
Really good stuff, and I feel like the conversation could just like keep building from there. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you one question in terms of, like, what is a question that dads should be asking themselves about the topic of emotional regulation for themselves and teaching their children? And then the follow up to that would be, well, what's one action that a dad can take moving forward around the topic of emotional regulation?
Sure. I think it would start with sort of the question that you're asking yourself, and this should happen probably in some context of like meditation, mindfulness, prayer time, those kinds of things. There's another thing we didn't really talk about here today, but I think is really important, which is like, how am I doing with my own emotional regulation, and what are the skills that I need to develop for myself, so that I can then be an effective practitioner of emotional regulation myself, and then teach those things to my kids. And I think the easiest place to start in terms of like teaching kids about emotion, especially if you have small kids, is just to steal this from my wife, is just like, start with something simple, like just ask your kids about their day. And you're doing that anyway, right? It's like, how was your day today? What happened? You're sort of using some of this vague language, but using that as an opportunity to teach them specific topics, I think, is a really nice way to do this. And so to say, what's one thing that happened today that made you sad? What's one thing that made you angry? What's one thing that made you happy? Expand that to other emotions as you see fit. What made you frustrated? Did you feel jealous today at all? There's all kinds of different emotions, and you can look up the like feeling wheel. Sometimes that's another way to sort of learn about all the different words for emotions that you can talk about. And just like ask your kids specifically, like, what's one thing? And sometimes my kids say, you know what, today wasn't really an angry day. I don't remember anything that happened today that made me angry. And like, that's fine. But sometimes they do have one, right? And so just kind of talking to your kids about like seeing their life through the emotions that they felt helps them sort of internalize those feelings, learn what they mean, and then sometimes that also leads to a conversation. We do this sometimes now with my oldest. He's kind of just getting into that, where you can say like, oh, and then how did you respond when you felt that anger or when you felt that sadness, right? Like what did you do with that? And was that a good choice or was that a bad choice? And how can we do it differently in the future, right? Not in a way that's like judgmental or discipline or anything like that, but just as a, at the end of the day is a nice time to just kind of reflect on the day. You're sort of teaching them the mindfulness and prayer and that kind of stuff at the same time too, where you're saying like, what's something that made me angry today? And did I respond to that well, or should I have responded to it differently in some way? And those are the kinds of conversations that will grow into. But the one basic thing to start with is like, what's one thing that made you sad today?
It's great. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, because of time, we're gonna have to wrap it here, but can you tell the listeners where they can find out more about you?
Sure. I would say the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. That's probably where I'm most active. You can find the Docs to Dads page there, Docs, DOCS, the number 2 dads, or you can search for my name, Scott Grant. Most of the stuff I post on LinkedIn, I post on my own personal page. So please feel free to reach out, follow me, connect with me, whatever you think is appropriate. Second is probably Instagram at Docs to Dads Pod. Again, DOCS, the number 2 dads pod there, or you can email me at docstodadspod@gmail.com.
That's great. Ed.
Fantastic. Scott, want to say thank you so much for taking time as a dad, a father, a man, a great pediatrician, and a servant for dads and those who love them and dads and their families and those who love them. And just want to say thank you again. Want to bless you for what you have, are, and will be doing. If there's anything we can do to help you amplify in this challenge we have together, love to have anything we can do to help you out. So thanks again for your time.
Great. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye. All right. Mr. Drew.
One thing that's been sitting in here, and I feel like some dads still have this question, is they're like, I want my child to become mentally tough or mentally strong. I don't want them to, show. And I feel like they run away from this topic of emotional regulation because they think that it doesn't help their children become mentally or emotionally strong. And I wish we had talked about it with Dr. Grant, but I actually think it's the opposite. The more that you teach a child how to navigate and manage their emotions, the more that you gain mastery of yourself, the more actually powerful, the more resilient, the more capable, the more strong like you are, because you can work through those things in healthier ways, productive ways that don't damage your health, that don't damage your relationships, that don't damage the things around you. So anyways, that's just been sitting there. And I know it's not our typical what we took away, but that I feel like is a challenge for some fathers because they fear this will not allow their children to grow stronger. And I want to just say it's actually wrong. It will help them grow much stronger, more resilient. Anyways, that's my soapbox there. Your takeaway, Ed.
Well, you know what? We can always ask if you can come back and do a conversation on that.
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a whole conversation topic on itself.
And I would love to actually have listeners' questions or challenges around that. Like, no, I don't believe that, or whatever those challenges are, so that we can actually explore it and have a good conversation about it.
There we go. Well, so many knowledge bombs, but respond and repair. Respond and repair. Like I would say to Dr. Scott, use that as your tagline, my man, and trademark that. Go after that. I think that's I already have ideas on how you could market that, but I'll leave it be. But the respond and repair. And I think not only when dads with their or male caregivers with the kids, but in their own daily walk, right? We just need to think of just not to our kids, but in our own, because as Dr. Scott, the kids are watching and they're going to duplicate. So respond and repair. So respond and repair in yourself and anyone that's important to you, but and also respond and repair with your children. That's what leaves one of the many things that left with today's conversation. As always, the Dad Central Show is sponsored by Dove Men Plus Care. Dove Men Plus Care believes when care is the best of a man, because when men care for themselves and others, there's a positive impact. As always, as Drew said, we like to get feedback, suggestions, comments. What do you think? What subjects would you like us to host? We can bring some of our previous friends back and they can go in deep on specific comments and specific topics. Also, please listen to the replays of our epic conversations, dadcentral.ca/podcast. And also make sure you rate us, especially on Apple Podcasts. And then finally, lots of free resources, dadcentral.ca. A lot of free resources, by the way. So as always, like to say, don't just manage your time, manage your energy. Remember to give yourselves grace, and looking forward to seeing you and hearing you next time. Be well, God bless, peace well, keep the faith, and walk good.